Are there any questions? One of the I got a bunch of calls about the bombing, obviously last week, the horrible bombing, and sort of from reporters and people. I didn't speak to very many people about it, but a lot of people were asking questions about what might be a network angle to the events. And if I had time today, I would actually open it up for conversation and see if you guys had some ideas. But I just want to highlight one possible idea, since we were just finishing a set of 4 lectures on what can you do with network methods. One of the things that happens in these types of mass casualty situations is rumors, false information that spreads. And it actually affected our community, where a lot of people thought there were bombs in Harvard Square, and a lot of misinformation about what was happening, and information spreading rapidly. And so the question becomes, or after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, there was lots of crazy, incorrect information that was spreading. And information spreads through networks. And the question is, are the spreading dynamics of false information different than the spreading dynamics of true information? First interesting intellectual question. And another interesting intellectual question is, if you were a public policymaker and you wanted to tamp down on false information, it's like putting your fingers in a dike, right? I mean, you can't talk to everyone. No, that's false, that's false, that's false. You can't go to every single person and tell them that's false or that's false. And there's constantly new false information. So what you really would like to do, ideally, is identify targeted individuals within the system to whom, if you released accurate information, that accurate information would spread through the system in such a fashion so as to interrupt the flow of the misinformation. It's actually not dissimilar from the issue of like vaccine behavior spreading through a social network. And the behavioral epidemic is spreading in parallel to the pathogenic epidemic, and they're causing interference with each other. So there's actually a whole set of ideas that could be engaged about how you could exploit network methods for one tiny aspect of this problem. There are others as well, but that's just to give you one idea. Okay, so last time we talked about the nature of material, human, and social capital. We talked about how social capital is an emergent property of social systems. We explored aspects of social capital and how it affects health. And we considered different kinds of social capital, like norms, information channels, and appropriable organizations. And we also considered the public goods nature of social capital, which helps to explain why there's underinvestment in it. And today I'm going to be returning to how another macro-social structure, the neighborhood where one lives, this sort of geographic environment, can affect individuals' health. Now, this would seem to be an obvious contention. And in fact, Hippocrates writes about this thousands of years ago. But the pathways and the processes of geographic effects on an individual's health can actually be very hard to tease out. So here's our own neighborhood. Which houses at Harvard have a reputation for drinking? Mather. So usually the students usually people say Mather. I'm sorry to say, but that's what they usually say. And the question is, what causes that? Why might potentially, if true, I'm not saying it's true, but let's just for the moment assume it's true. Why might the Mather students be more prone to drinking and drunkenness? They're sad because they're far from the quad. Thank you. Yes, it's deep disappointment. Yes.
But Matter and the format of the rooms makes it conducive for having parties, and there's lots of people around there, so it's easy to gather around.
Excellent. So there's something about the built environment at Mather, the rooms. I've never been in the rooms at Mather, but I understand they're very nice. The rooms at Mather and the neighborhood around Mather that induces Matherites to just take up, drinking. Any other ideas? Yeah. Very good. So there's a liquor store. That's right. I used to have a photograph. I need to get a photograph of the liquor store. But yeah, there's a liquor store literally right across the street from Mather. So that lowers the activation energy. It makes it much easier to get liquor if you're at Mather than somewhere else. Excellent. Other ideas?
Looks like a prison.
Looks like a prison. People are driven to drink because of the adverse environment. Yeah. That was your answer. Okay. What other ideas about why Mather might be especially prone to alcohol? Is there something about the culture at Mather, maybe? Maybe, yeah?
I think years ago, there used to be a very long happy hour there. That's changed now.
Okay, so there was some kind of tradition of happy hour at Mather, which was there years ago. Is it still there? Does anyone know? Yeah, okay, there's some particular kind of tradition. So there's something about the culture at Mather, some kind of intergenerational transmission about this place, such that the students at Mather. Could it be the students themselves? No, yes, no. Who thinks no? Yeah, why no? They're randomly assigned. So we don't think, because the students are randomly assigned, we don't really believe the Mather students, they like to think that they are different than the rest of us, but actually they're not. They're the same as other students anywhere else. One possible explanation that's been offered is that the reason the Matherites drink so much is they're very close to Dunster, and that's causing the problem. Another hypothesis that's held by the quad students is that they're feeling very bad about themselves for being rivered. So there are a lot of possible explanations for why this might be the case. And the thing that's very interesting is that a question arises, what inferences would we draw if Mather were always a house, going back 20 years, even before randomization, in which there was a high prevalence of drinking and drunkenness? What would that say to us about whether it's an effect of composition or of context? The fact that it was always that way suggests that it's not the students that are in Mather, but rather something about the environment that makes this come to pass. Now, which Harvard houses, on the other hand, have a reputation for self-confidence or smugness? Okay. So now, why might that be? Do they have any rational basis for this smugness? Now, the students we just established were randomly assigned. It's not like the smugger students were preferentially sorted into atoms, as in bygone days, before randomization. So there's something about atoms that induces this pathology that arises in the students after they are randomly assigned there. So there's something about the culture of the environment that has this effect. So remember, we talked about this earlier in the class. We talked about compositional and contextual effects of neighborhoods. Neighborhood composition matters. Who's in the neighborhood matters. And this is the difference that people make to places. So who is where affects the properties of that neighborhood. And conversely, neighborhood context matters, and this is the difference that places make to people. And suppose, for example, that neighborhood A has twice the mortality rate of neighborhood B. Well, what if everyone in neighborhood A is really old? The composition of that neighborhood has older people. That alone could just account for the difference. It's not that there's something toxic about neighborhood A that's killing off the residents in neighborhood A. Maybe instead it's just that, the people who live in neighborhood A are more prone to death. So today we're going to be examining the evidence that context really matters even after taking into account composition. So after taking into account who lives where, can we still make a claim about the impact of this area, whether it's a Harvard house or a neighborhood, as we'll be discussing shortly, upon the constituent individuals? Well, how could neighborhoods matter? Let's take a closer look at what attributes of place might affect health. So there are a number of ways in which the environment in which you live could affect your health. There's the physical environment, air pollution, noise, the housing stock, traffic patterns, for example. There's the service environment, groceries, fast food outlets, health clinics, the supply of doctors or pharmacies. And there's a social environment, for example, social disorder, local norms, or local social capital, which could affect your health in some specific way. So I'm going to take a quick overview of different diverse sources of evidence for the effects of place. I'm going to show you very staccato, like a smorgasbord of studies that looks at different ways that place can affect health, before focusing on 3 or 4 key examples at the latter part of the lecture today, 2 of which are specifically with respect to health: the Chicago heat wave study and the moving to opportunity experiment. And then I'll talk about one other study which was assigned in the readings with respect to non-health outcomes. So here's a very well done study looking at small area effects on cardiovascular events. This was a study about 10 years ago now by Diaz-Roux in the New England Journal of Medicine. So they looked at 4 communities, which are shown there across the country. There were 13,000 residents. They were followed for nearly 10 years. And during the follow-up, there were 615 incident coronary events. And they looked at the neighborhood disadvantage of block groups. These individuals were slotted within 595 block groups, which are small census units, smaller than a census tract, that includes a number of city blocks or residential neighborhoods clustered together, a small little neighborhood, which corresponds to about what you would think of as the neighborhood you grew up, would be a block group. And what they did is they adjusted for individual level income, education, occupation, and so forth. So net of the attributes of the constituent individuals does something about the area defined as a block group, little neighborhood, does that affect what happens to those individuals with respect to coronary artery disease. And so here's some of the findings from that study. This shows neighborhood disadvantage and heart disease. So on the y-axis is the incidence per 1,000 person years, and then the bars show different levels of neighborhood disadvantage. The groupings of the bars show different levels of personal income. On the far left are the poorest, and on the right are the richest. And then neighborhood disadvantage within each group indicates how much disadvantage is in the neighborhood. So for example, amongst the poorest individuals, let me get my pointer. Amongst the poorest individuals, if you live in a most disadvantaged neighborhood, you have a worse risk of death than in the best advantaged neighborhood. And this monotonically declines in all of the personal income categories. So above and beyond how rich you are, living in a disadvantaged community increases your risk of having coronary artery disease. And note, one of the things that's interesting here is that note, like compared to a few lectures ago when we talked about income inequality, rather than looking at the income inequality of the local area, here we are looking at the actual average income of the local area. Okay, so before, kind of weirdly, I introduced you to the notion of the spread, the distribution of income in the neighborhood around you. And now I'm saying, well, let's look not at the second moment of the distribution, but the first moment of the distribution. Let's look at the average income, and we see how does the average income in the area around you affect you net of your own income and net of all these other traits of your own, followed prospectively. So I panel you today, I measure these attributes in you today, and then I look at what happens to you in the future. And I see, gee, if you live in a terrible neighborhood now, it's going to increase your risk of heart disease in the future. So here's an aspect of the physical environment that might be matter. This is the number of streets you have to cross when going to school, and that logically could affect whether you are injured in the course of your life. And the layout of streets and the location of schools, things over which you have no control, structure rather than your agency. You don't control where the schools are located in your neighborhood or what the traffic lights are doing and so forth, could place you at risk. So this shows the average number of streets crossed in having to go to school, and this shows the injury rate per 1,000 people, and it shows that the more streets you have to cross to get to school, not surprisingly, the greater the risk of your being injured. Here's another example of where you live affects what recreational facilities you have nearby. These are recreational facilities in two neighborhoods of Glasgow, Scotland, and the type of neighborhood, the rich one and the poor one, athletic tracks, boating ponds, bowling greens, these are very Scottish, playing fields, putting greens, golf courses, tennis courts, and swimming pools. Not surprisingly, the richer neighborhood has many more of these amenities than the poorer neighborhood, and these things might affect your ability, your survival, your health. Or something a bit closer to home that was made the news a few years ago, this is the where you are affects whether you're exposed to bed bugs. So there's a little website you can go to, bedbugregistry.com, and you can flag it if you stay at a hotel and there are bed bugs at the hotel, and there was a big epidemic of bed bugs. Is it still in Manhattan? I don't know. Those of you from Manhattan, is it still a problem? Not anymore. It was a fad that went away. But anyway, it was a serious problem, and you can see Manhattan and the whole just struck with bed bugs. And so where you live could affect your probability of this exposure. Here's another idea. Here's an aspect now not of the physical environment, but rather of the service environment. This is where you live affects the availability of fast food outlets. This is a population per outlet according to the weekly income per district. And in the richer districts, there are more people per outlet, hence fewer outlets per person. Whereas in the poor district, not surprisingly, there are more outlets per person or a lower population per outlet. So, in poor neighborhoods, the quality of the food that's available, not surprisingly, is worse. And here's an example of a medical service, which, like bed bugs, was also studied in New York City. Here what they looked at is where you live can affect what kinds of medicines you get. This is opioid pain relief supplies in pharmacies in New York neighborhoods. So the question is, your doctor prescribes an opioid for you because you're at the end of your life and you're suffering. Or you had surgery and you're suffering, you're in agony. And we know that pain relief, if I relieve your pain, I'm telling you this now, if you ever have any surgery, don't let them get away without treating your pain, because not only is it good for you to have less pain, but actually it accelerates healing if your pain is adequately treated. So if you had knee surgery or something and your pain is well cared for, you'll heal faster than if it's not well cared for. So your doctor prescribes you a medication because you're at the end of life or you're post-surgical pain or something like that, and you go to your local pharmacy to fill it, to get the medication. Well, it turns out that it's not easy to fill that uniformly across the city. This shows the race-ethnic composition of the neighborhood, the percent black. This shows the total number of pharmacies in each of the neighborhoods. Not surprisingly, the whiter communities in New York have larger numbers of pharmacies available, and the percent of outlets with opioids declines. So the blacker the neighborhood, the less likely it is that your pharmacy will stock an opioid to treat your pain, which is really preposterous. But you don't control that. You live in whatever neighborhood you live in. You can pick your neighborhood. We'll come back to that. But conditional on your picking your neighborhood, the pharmacy might or might not have this type of medication available to you at a moment when you might need it. And in fact, place matters a lot in healthcare. All kinds of things show small area variation, vary from place to place. This slide shows geographic variation according to 306 hospital referral regions in the use of doctors near the end of life. Now, I've been very slippery so far. I've been talking about geographic aggregations. We talked about 2 neighborhoods in Glasgow. We talked about block groups in the census tracts. Now we're dividing the whole nation into 300 categories. There are lots of different categories, lots of different areas of geographic aggregation. I'm just completely eliding right now. I'm just blowing by. But the point is that place matters. And looking now at these 306 areas, let's look at some examples. So this is where you live affects whether you use a specialist at the end of life. This shows the ratio of rates of medical specialist visits during the last 6 months of life compared to the US average. So the blue areas, they see more specialists compared to the light blue areas. And there's a lot of variation across the country from place to place according to whether or not you see a specialist in caring for you near the end of your life. And the reason that this is important is that it says that where you live affects the kind of care that you can get. And in fact, there's been an ongoing project at Dartmouth College or Dartmouth University for the last 20 years or more, known as the Dartmouth Atlas, which has been plotting and it makes publicly available data such as this regarding small area variation in all kinds of things. So the Dartmouth Atlas project demonstrates that to the extent that end-of-life issues are addressed in practice, they are resolved in ways that depend on where the patient happens to live, not on the patient's preferences or power of care to extend life. So what happens to you near the end of your life doesn't matter so much according to your own agency. What really matters is what's happening in the neighborhood around you. It's the structure that affects you. And the American experience of death varies remarkably from one community to another. Whether a person is hospitalized, whether they're admitted to an ICU, whether they visit a doctor, and so on, all vary from place to place. In fact, the chance that a decedent was an inpatient in an acute care hospital at the time of their death varied by a factor of nearly 3, from less than 20% to almost 50%. Or the chance of being admitted to an intensive care unit at the time of death varied by a factor of nearly 5, from 6% to almost 30% of all deaths. Or the number of visits to a physician's varied by a factor of nearly 6, from an average of less than 9 to almost 50. So all of these attributes, the kind of medical care you get near the end of your life, varies tremendously from place to place in the country. And this is further evidence this is further evidence that where you live affects the kind of health care you get, and it illustrates a phenomenon that we won't go into known as physician-induced demand, whereby the supplier of goods is able to induce demand for those goods, among other explanations for this phenomenon. So place matters a lot in healthcare. Another thing that might matter is where you live could affect whether you have sensible, vaccinated neighbors. This was an assigned reading. Now, given the negative externalities associated with vaccine refusal, if you choose not to be vaccinated, it harms me. Just like if you choose to smoke, it harms me, an externality. Given the fact that this externality has been appreciated for 200 or 300 years, it's been widely understood, and in fact it was codified by the United States Supreme Court in a landmark case adjudicated in 1905, that states could pass and enforce compulsory vaccination. We can force you guys to be vaccinated. But states also could allow exemptions for diverse reasons, including religious or personal reasons. And it turns out people have begun to abuse this privilege in a really concerning way in our society over the last 10 years, driven in part by ignorant celebrities who have really incorrect, utterly false beliefs about whether vaccination affects autism or all kinds of things, which have been repeatedly examined in incredibly sophisticated ways and shown to be false. And it turns out that there is geographic clustering of non-medical exemptions to vaccination, and that this geographic clustering can result in the local accumulation of a critical mass of susceptible children, setting the stage for epidemic outbreaks in our society. For example, the county level rate in the state of Washington of exemptions, people refusing to be vaccinated as small children, varies from between 1.2% to 26.9%. And this is a map taken from the readings that shows the variation from place to place in the fraction of exemptions, the exemption rate from place to place in the state. So for example, here in Ferry County, 26.9% of the people refuse to be vaccinated compared to other counties in the state. And in fact, it turns out that this exemption rate is associated, not surprisingly, with disease outbreaks. And the geographic clustering of vaccine refusal can result in outbreaks in area populations, including so-called innocent bystanders. For example, infants and immunocompromised individuals who are harmed by the choice of their neighbors refusing to be vaccinated for these conditions. And ironically and somewhat unusually, the unvaccinated children tend to be richer and whiter and tend to have a married mother with a college education. So this is a rare case in which, very weirdly, socioeconomically privileged individuals have adopted a norm which actually not only is harmful to them, but is harmful to their community. Now, there's precedent in the United States for this type of behavior. About 100, maybe 60 or 70 years ago, it turns out that the adoption of smoking behavior was first among sort of relatively upper class or well-off individuals, so maybe we're seeing a similar kind of thing happening here in this situation, which I hope actually will be able to reverse. Now let's take a look at some aspects of the, any questions on that so far? All of you should be vaccinated. And I should say, you don't need to get vaccinated against everything, so arguments can be made about chickenpox vaccination, arguments can be made about HPV. Who knows about HPV? Yeah? Okay, so who knows why we require that infants be vaccinated for HPV? Anyone know why we require infants to be vaccinated for HPV? Who here got vaccinated for HPV? So most of you. Who here was vaccinated when they were like adolescents? Okay, why were you vaccinated when you were an adolescent, not a baby? Anyone want to tell me? Yeah? Oh, okay, in your case. Yeah, okay, so HPV is human papillomavirus. It's a very rational thing to be vaccinated for. The reason we vaccinate infants is not because infants are having, and you get it's a sexually transmitted disease. Women especially should be vaccinated, but so should men. And men should be vaccinated not only because it interrupts the spread of the epidemic, but also there's some benefit to the men also. But the reason we have a policy of vaccinating babies is that it makes public health sense. The kids are coming to the doctor and they're getting all these other vaccines. Tacking on HPV at that stage of life makes sense. It doesn't make clinical sense. There's no reason. If you have a reliable family and you knew for a fact that you would get yourself vaccinated before you became sexually active, you can wait to be vaccinated till later on. So I'm not saying that every single vaccine that's available should be administered to everybody and it should all be done in infancy, but certainly things like polio, measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, etc., all the standard ones, there is abundant evidence that it benefits you and others. And it's not a coincidence, I think, incidentally. I'm sure that at Harvard, this hasn't been studied, I don't know if it's been studied, there's been probably a rise in vaccine refusals among students at Harvard. We had a pertussis outbreak at Harvard College this past November, and it's quite possible that there was a relationship between a rising prevalence of vaccine refusal and pertussis. Yeah?
So I know that vaccines just increase your memory immunity, so like if you're encountered with a pathogen, you just have a response and don't get sick. Does that mean we're still constantly being bombarded by things like polio, or just not?
No, yes and no, but generally no. And the reason is that we don't have a reservoir of polio in the population. So in a situation like that, it's not like you're being bombarded by it. You would have to be bombarded by it from somebody or somewhere, assuming there's no enzootic reservoir. That is to say, it's not leaping from animals to humans. So you get herd immunity, which probably most of you know. If you vaccinate about 96% of the population for most conditions, it varies for conditions, the epidemic can't take root because there's no transmission probability. Like the rare unvaccinated or susceptible individual, if he or she somehow gets this condition, there's no one for them to give it to, and the germ, dies out. The individual has the disease, and then there's nowhere else for it to go. All right, so let's take a look now at some aspects of the social environment. For example, crime and a general breakdown in the social fiber of a community have been shown to be associated with the health outcomes of residents. Here's one way to objectively assess the physical environment in order to get insight into the social environment. It's called the Broken Windows Index. And you might quantify these things. You might go into a neighborhood and look at the percent of properties with major structural damage, street segments with graffiti. You could actually even do this with Google now. In the olden days, you have to get in your own car and drive there and look out the window and record all this stuff. Now you could make this index, if you want, using Google Maps for a neighborhood at a distance, far away from it. Street segments with graffiti, street segments with accumulated garbage, street segments with abandoned vehicles. And you could compute a measure like this called the Broken Windows Index and combine them into a symbol index. And it turns out there's a link between measures like this and something like the transmission rate for sexually transmitted diseases. Now, how do street segments with accumulated garbage or graffiti, they're not directly affecting the probability of having a sexually transmitted disease, but they're having, via a kind of social mechanism, an effect on this transmission. And this happens net of the actual poverty of the neighborhood and net of the traits of the individuals involved. So for example, this slide shows case rates of gonorrhea. So this shows the Broken Windows Index and rates of gonorrhea per 1,000 people in New Orleans neighborhoods, published in AJPH about 10 years ago now. So here's the low broken windows and high broken windows. And here's whether there's a low poverty neighborhood or a high poverty neighborhood. And whether the neighborhood is low or high poverty, if it's a low broken windows neighborhood, the rate of gonorrhea is roughly the same, 27.4 versus 27.5. But within each poverty category, if it's a low poverty neighborhood, if it's a high poverty neighborhood and it has high broken windows, you get an increase in the rate of gonorrhea. And if it's a low poverty neighborhood and you have low broken windows versus high, you also get an increase, although not as much as in the high poverty neighborhood. So note that regardless of the poverty level, in low broken windows neighborhoods, the rate is about the same. And it is worse in high broken windows neighborhoods, especially if those are also poor. So it's not just how poor the neighborhood is, but also something about the social fiber of a community that is material. And we're going to examine how neighborhoods can affect norms with respect to seemingly unrelated behaviors in just a bit. So how is it that the broken windows in the neighborhood affects gonorrhea transmission? There's a kind of indirect way in which this happens, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Here's an example of a low broken windows environment looks like, even though it's poor. So this is a poor neighborhood, but this is nevertheless a high poverty neighborhood, but nevertheless low gonorrhea rate in New Orleans in Louisiana. There's something different about this neighborhood than an equally poor neighborhood that also has a high broken windows index. And similarly, areas that are relatively free of crime and that have greater social cohesion are also those areas that had fewer deaths during the Chicago heat wave of 1995. So this shows local crime rates and local heat wave deaths during the Chicago heat wave. I had just arrived in Chicago in 1995 as a new assistant professor when the heat wave struck. It was just unbelievable. People went out to the streets to sleep at night because it was so hot. It was like 120 degrees or something. I mean, literally unbelievable. But what this map of Chicago shows, and here's Lake Michigan, is that the neighborhoods that had high violent crime rates, which are shown in these little dark circles, were also the neighborhoods, by and large, that had high rates, shown in the darker coloring, of heat wave deaths. Something about the neighborhood, apparently, was simultaneously increasing the risk of these two very disparate phenomena, violent crime and heat wave death. Now, there were 700 excess deaths during the heat wave, and these were unequally distributed across the city. This slide shows the heat index, or the apparent temperature, which is a function not only of the temperature, but also of the relative humidity. So where I come from in Greece, I could easily be out in the sun at 115 degrees. It doesn't bother me at all. I actually kind of like it, but it's 0% humidity. You take me to, Delhi in monsoon season, and I wilt because it's not only hot, but it's humid, and it's a killer. And so you have to combine those two to get a sense in this type of a heat index that's shown on the right-hand side of the chart. and total deaths and the cause of case subjects in Chicago from July 12th to 19th, the 7 days in Chicago. So here's the period of the heat wave. Here's the number of deaths that's shown here. Here's total deaths in Chicago in all three categories. So this is due to heat or cardiovascular disease, due to cardiovascular disease alone, or due to heat alone. And you get this very sharp peak in deaths that occurs during the heat wave. And here's the heat index that's plotted over here. So the peak in deaths follows by a couple of days the peak in the heat index. And other work that was done that looked at some of the risk factors, looked at living conditions and types of social contacts, and found that they made a material difference in survival in this study of 339 matched pairs of subjects and controls, which I don't think I gave you in the reading. And so what in this study they did is they did a case control study where they looked at individuals who died during the heat wave versus those that did not, and they looked at things that how living conditions and types of social contacts affected the probability of death. So here this says, had access to an air-conditioned lobby in the building where you lived. And so the case subjects, 10% of them had access to an air-conditioned lobby versus controls where 20% had access. So having access to an air-conditioned lobby significantly reduces your risk of death. No shocker, no surprise there. But look at some of these other social contact variables. This shows participated in group activities. 46% of the people who died participated in group activities compared to 55% of those who did not die, who were otherwise identical matched controls, participated in group activities, and this was statistically significant. How could participating in a group activity prevent you from dying during the heat wave? Yeah. You.
Social support.
Not you, her, sorry. Yes? Very good. So both material and social things. That's exactly right. Yeah. You with the glasses. Yeah.
Someone is more likely to check in on you just off those well-being.
Yeah. You didn't show up for the group meeting. They call up and they say, and plus people are not stupid. They know there's a heat wave. It's like, oh my God, Susie didn't show up. Let's go knock on her door and see what's going on with her. Or here is had access to transportation. Or here is having a pet at home. Why does having a pet save your life in a heat wave? Canary in a coal mine. Yeah, pet dies, and you're saying, damn, I better get out of here. Okay, a less morbid explanation for a pet. Yeah, in the back there. I'm sorry, so how does that animal sensing the temperature prevent you from dying? Yeah, and in the limit, then he'll die, and you'll say, darn, it's hot. I better get out of here. Okay, not a bad thought, but there's another way that having a pet. When you have a pet, what do you have to do with a pet? You have to go outside. You have to walk and take care of the pet, right? And so that obligation to the pet gets you out of your house, gets you out of the stifling hot, makes you interact with other people, provides you with some kind of, lowers your risk as found in the situation. And in fact, Kleinenberg has looked at this in depth in his book called Heat Wave. And here are some results of his comparison of two different Chicago neighborhoods that had similar socioeconomic status parameters, but very different outcomes in the heat wave based on other attributes such as social capital and measures of civic life in these neighborhoods. So he looked at two communities he calls North Lawndale and South Lawndale, and here's Chicago as a benchmark. Here's the senior poverty level is somewhat similar in the two groups. Seniors living alone is very similar in the two groups, but heat wave death, very different. 10 times the heat wave death rate in North Lawndale compared to South Lawndale, despite seeming similarity on some of these other variables. And here's a street, just to be clear, North Lawndale is worse, okay? So here's a street view of North Lawndale neighborhood, and here's a street view of South Lawndale neighborhood, okay? And Kleinenberg points out the relevance of commercial life in South Lawndale, also known as Little Village, which pulled isolated seniors into public spaces, for example, if they had pets or whatever, and provided seniors with safe, air-conditioned commercial venues, for example, where they could escape at least part of the time from the heat. And here's what some of the residents had to say. Here's North Lawndale, Father Michael. He said, I had no fear until they told me, oh no, it's not safe. These people steal on the corners and so on. They would tell me that there would be drive-by shootings. They would fight among themselves, but I would be caught in the crossfire. And some feared even that if you walk, they can come and snatch you. That's North Lawndale. Here's South Lawndale, Father Morales. He says, even though we have gangs, people still feel comfortable in the streets. You walk around and you see people sitting on the front steps everywhere. Or another resident said, we look out for each other in our neighborhood. If something is going on, we'll see it and call each other or the police. So the collective attributes of the neighborhood seem to make all of the difference in whether individual residents lived or died of the heat during this heat wave. Now, as in all observational studies that we've been studying the whole semester so far, one can begin to wonder about various sorts of problems that might threaten our confidence that there's a real causal effect of neighborhood upon individual outcomes. Can we be sure that something causal is going on and maybe it's just an association, not really a causation? And there are all kinds of challenges in neighborhood research. So there's the challenge of disentangling compositional from contextual effects. And actually, you can respond to this statistically in ways I've already shown you by using multi-level analysis, where you account for the attributes of the individuals and nest them within the neighborhoods. That type of statistical approach can actually substantially respond to this concern. There's the problem of household mobility. Well, maybe people choose to locate in places, so maybe people love fast food. So when I'm buying a house, I say, I need to have a McDonald's next door. So I go and I buy a house with a McDonald's next door, and then I drop dead, but it's not because the McDonald's made me drop dead, it's because I chose to live near the McDonald's, for example. You can begin to address that by using longitudinal data, by having data across time, so you can see where people are coming and going from. And you can see whether the stores or the infrastructure is being preferentially situated in one location over another. And finally, there's the problem of endogeneity, which is trying to get the causal order straight, which comes first, the neighborhood or the individual effects. And you can address this by using a kind of econometric technique known as instrumental variables methods, which you don't need to know and I won't go into today, or experiments, which I will go into right now, which shows you how you can randomly assign people to different kinds of neighborhood exposures and then see experimentally whether if I drop you in one neighborhood versus another, does that neighborhood affect your health outcomes in particular ways. And so the idea here is that outcomes in individuals and neighborhood features might be artifactually related. For example, as I just mentioned, people might choose where they live, and those who don't like their neighborhood and are able to do so might move out, or sick people might move closer to amenities, for example, or further from amenities because they don't have money, or who knows what. All kinds of complicated ways where the movement of people and the choice of neighborhoods could lead to an artifactual association between neighborhood and individual outcomes. Or, as I just mentioned also, services might choose where to locate. So junk food outlets might move in where there is demand. So it's not that the presence of the fast food outlet increases your risk of death. It's that I say, oh, I'm a fast food joint. Where should I put my store? I should put it near where there are already people who already want what I have to sell. So it's not my fault. It's not the structure. It's the agency of the individuals that is associated with this outcome. So what we'd really like to do is do an experiment where we randomly assign people where they live or what kind of environment they face. And I'm going to now review with you 4 experiments. Very different experiments, very different procedures that kind of speak to this issue of the effect of place on individual outcomes. And one very famous experiment, one is known as the moving to opportunity experiment, and it's been recently completed and still being analyzed over the last 10 years. And between 1994 and 1997, 4,248 families in Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York were randomly assigned to one of 3 different treatment arms. They were given a third, or roughly one group, was given a housing voucher that could be used to move to a low poverty, a neighborhood that had less than 10% poverty, a low poverty neighborhood, and they were given counseling on how to move. A second was given housing voucher with no geographic restriction to go anywhere they want, including a poverty neighborhood, so they could just move but maybe to a similarly poor neighborhood. And a third control group was given no new assistance, but they continued to be eligible for public housing. And in 2002, many years later, one adult, mostly a woman, from each family were followed up and interviewed on 5 domains: economic self-sufficiency, mental health, physical health, risky behavior, and education. So if we don't force you to move, but we make it very easy for you to move, and we study how does being randomly assigned a voucher which allows you to move, and most of those people did move, although not all, how does being assigned the opportunity to move affect, so strictly it's not actually having moved, It's the opportunity to move to a better neighborhood. How does that assignment experimentally affect various outcomes? So here's the depression outcome. Here's what happened if you look at the control group versus the traditional group versus, just given mobility versus the low poverty group. You had to move to a low poverty neighborhood. Here's the impact on major depression. So a decrease from, 22% to 18% in this NBR working paper that looked at this. So moving to a richer neighborhood, even giving a fixed level of human capital, had certain health effects, for example, on major depression. And here's an effect on obesity, which found an effect, a small effect, but nevertheless detectable if you move to a different low poverty neighborhood, you are less likely to become obese. So if I randomly assign you to a neighborhood that's a richer neighborhood rather than a poor neighborhood, your risk of obesity declines. So this is a very nice study. Here's another sort of quasi-experimental study that was published in Science. It's a classic study. It's published like 20 years ago now, or 30 years, my goodness, 30 years ago now. In this study here, there were 46 patients, 23 pairs of patients that underwent cholecystectomy between 1972 and 1981 during the months of May to October, so spring and summer and early fall, in a 200-bed Pennsylvania hospital. And these individuals were plausibly randomly assigned to different rooms. Some of the patients' rooms looked out and saw trees. And some of the patient rooms looked out and saw a brick wall. Okay? So everything else was the same about these patients, but the treatment patients got to see trees, and the control patients got to see a brick wall. And then we're going to measure different things about the outcome of these patients afterwards. For example, we'll measure the length of stay. And we found that it was found that individuals that looked out onto trees, and this was in the summer months when there was foliage on the trees, had a 1 day shorter stay. Average stay was about 8 days or 7 days, and average stay was about 9 days length of stay, and patients that looked out at trees stayed at about 8 days. So they got out of the hospital a full day earlier just by being assigned a nicer view from their window. Okay? In addition, it was looked at how much analgesia, how much pain relief. Now, raise your hands if you've ever had surgery. Raise your hands if it hurt a lot after 24 hours after surgery. Yeah, so you come back from surgery, and the first 24 hours you're thinking, that's not so bad. If you had an appendectomy, you've had a knee surgery or something. But then the operative medications wear off, and you're in agony. And it's very difficult, unfortunately, I hate this, to persuade doctors and nurses to give you adequate pain relief. So what they've looked at is in this group that had cholecystectomy, they looked at the fraction of patients that were receiving different sorts of analgesia, strong, moderate, and weak. And in the wall group versus the tree group, there's not a lot of difference in days 0 to 1. This is not surprising because these patients are still having the anesthetic effects from the intraoperative procedure. And by day 6 or 7, there's also not a lot of difference. Very, 0.20, whatever it is, 0.22, I forgot if this is percent. I think this is percentage, yeah. Oh, no, not percent. It's the doses per patient. I'm sorry, this is measured in doses per patient. So you're getting 0.22 doses per patient in the wall group of strong analgesia versus 0.17 doses per patient in the tree group. Not a lot of difference by then because most patients are off their medication after a week. You don't need any post-surgical pain. But in the middle period, big difference, okay? So you get an average of 2.468 doses per patient in the wall group, less than half in the group that can see trees, and significantly lower again in the moderate group, and not surprisingly, a rise in the weak group. So the tree group, they're moving down the analgesic spectrum. They need less and less powerful medications. So here's another example of how the built environment affects your body in a very material way. And finally, here's a study that was in the assigned readings, also from Science, published a few years ago now. And this was a study in which they set out to explicitly test the broken windows idea. Okay? So they're going to use measures, they're going to artificially create area structural disorder, and they're going to look at whether this structural disorder has inter-outcome effects. So if we make broken windows, do we get gonorrhea? So now we're going to say if we artificially do graffiti or something, do we get some other different outcome? We're not testing if you walk by a wall and it has graffiti, does that make you do more graffiti? Okay? So we're looking at how if you walk by a wall that has a lot of graffiti, does it make you do something else? Does the broken windows environment adversely affect something else about you? So this experiment was done in Groningen in the Netherlands. This is an alley in that city located in a shopping area and commonly used to park bicycles. And in the order condition shown up at the top, the walls of the alley are clean, whereas in the disorder condition, they are covered in graffiti. Now that's terrible graffiti. I think it was probably done by the scientists. They didn't really have an actual graffiti artist who could do real graffiti. But nevertheless, there's graffiti, as you can see, that was put on the walls in the lower condition. And then the scientists hid behind a little hide. Who here has ever gone hunting? You know how you sit in a hide, right? So the scientists build a hide for themselves, and they're looking out at their prey, at the experimental subjects. And what they did is they attached to the bicycles a little flyer that said, from a non-existent nearby store, a flyer with an elastic band was attached to the handlebar, and it says, "We wish everyone happy holidays," and it was signed by the name of a non-existent sportswear shop. And the flyer had to be removed by the participants in order to use the handlebar of their bicycle. But then the investigators deliberately contrived that there be no garbage cans nearby, so you can't throw out the flyer in a garbage can, and they had a sign there, a sign that said, "No littering." Okay? So the question now comes, are you more likely to litter when there's graffiti on the wall than when there's no graffiti on the wall? What do you think? Yes. So they found experimentally that if you create a little disorder, that people then say, well, this is a terrible neighborhood, I'm going to go have sex without protection. No, I'm going to go and I'm going to throw the litter on the floor instead of obeying the kind of norm. And they looked at the people and they saw what they did. They could see them from hiding. And this sort of cross-norm inhibition effect of violating the anti-graffiti norm on littering was quite substantial. And of the participants in the order condition, the no graffiti, 33% littered compared to 69% in the disorder condition. Here's another experiment for the same paper. Here, what they did is, there are two signs in Dutch. One of them says, "Do not lock your bikes to this gate, to this fence." The other one says, "Do not walk through this fence." And you come out of the shopping mall, and your car is parked here. It's very tempting to walk right through there and get to your car. But actually, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to walk all the way around. You're not supposed to walk through the rule is you're not supposed to walk through there. You have to take a 200-meter detour around the situation. And in the order condition, there were 4 bicycles standing 1 meter away from the fence that were very deliberately not locked to the fence. And in the disorder condition, they locked a bunch of bikes to the fence. And then they watched how many people went around versus how many people went through. And they found that of the participants in the order condition where the bicycles were not locked to the fence, 27% stepped through the gap in the fence compared to 82% in the disorder condition. So locking a few bikes, making a little disorder, had a big effect on people's behavior, not coming up and locking their own bikes, but rather in a different outcome, namely violating the other rule of walking through the gap in a way that was not permissible. And finally, they did an experiment involving theft. They examined whether an envelope visibly containing a €5 note, and just like this, and hanging out of a mailbox would be stolen more often if a contextual norm was violated. The white addressed window envelope was sticking out of the mailbox and was very noticeable for anyone that was walking by the mailbox and contained this £5 note. And the participants were all people who singly passed the mailbox on foot. And in the baseline order condition, the mailbox was not covered with graffiti, whereas in the disorder condition, the mailbox was covered with graffiti. And here, if you walk by this envelope, you've got two options. What are your options? Raise your hand so I can call on you. Somebody. What are your options? Yeah. You can push it in, right? That's clearly the right thing to do. Poor person is trying to mail £5 to their relative. You just sort of you gently push it in to prevent the next schmo from doing what? Stealing it, which is the alternative. And so now they want to say, well, how often is it that people stole the envelope if there's graffiti on the mailbox? And they found that in the no graffiti condition, 13% stole the envelope, compared to the graffiti condition, 27%, more than twice as many stole the envelope. I've always wanted to repeat this study in Harvard Square, but being a housemaster, that would get me in trouble if I saw my students behaving, thieving. So neighborhoods can have, in fact, an enduring character that affects multiple aspects of our lives. And so I haven't emphasized this enough, the enduring character. There's something fundamental about neighborhoods, just going back to the Durkheim example of suicide, that outlasts the individuals. That's a contextual effect, distinct from the compositional effect. Something about the neighborhood that is the same across time, which affects the individuals within it, and that affects multiple aspects of our lives and stays constant across time. And in fact, neighborhoods are an aspect of structure that surrounds us. Such work on health and neighborhoods faces a set, as we have seen, of complicated conceptual and methodological challenges. And one challenge I haven't yet explored, but I did highlight, was the question of how do you define a neighborhood? Do neighborhood effects operate at different levels of size, and does this depend on which outcome is considered? Are we interested in the 306 HSAs in the country, or the 3,000 counties, or the 25,000 zip codes, or the tens of thousands of census tracts, or voting precincts, or census block groups, or blocks? Which level are we interested in? And of course, different levels may be relevant to different outcomes. When you think about whether your neighborhood is safe or dirty, you think about a few blocks or whether there is a crack house next door. When you think about whether there is a hospital, you think about a broader area. You don't care if there's a hospital next door, you care if there's one nearby. So you have a different level of geographic aggregation. And when you think about whether the air is polluted or the laws are fairly enforced, you think about still broader areas. So overall, neighborhoods have an enduring reality that transcends the people who reside within them, but has a specific effect depending on what outcome we're considering and the size of the neighborhood at stake. Thank you very much.